Hello everyone, and welcome to Comrade Tortoise's Nerd Hole. Now, I ought to explain the name. Politically, I'm not quite right. I see shades of pink. I'm kind of one of those European-style social democrats, so I'm that far away from communism. So whenever someone claims Obama is a socialist, no, I pretty much am one, and he's not one of us. That being said, this is kind of devoted to politics, kind of to religion, science, and other forms of profligate nerdery like science fiction and Star Wars. I do not consider Star Wars to be science fiction. I consider it to be fantasy because it has the literary elements of fantasy, and it's opposed to science fiction. It is simply set in space, but it has wizards, so it's fantasy. Alright. So, I am a PhD candidate in biology. I'm not going to say where, to protect the innocent and the guilty, for that matter. I study reproductive decision-making and meta-community structure in frogs. Yes, I am that damn nerdy. Hence the tortoise, actually. I'm kind of a herpetologist, so I study not just frogs, but everything else, but my primary focus, my research is frogs. Anyway. I'm also a bit of a polymath, so I've studied history, philosophy, especially ethics, and a couple of languages, including Latin and German. So that'll be fun. So I'm going a bit beyond what would be considered YouTube atheism. I'm getting off track here. Anyway, so first thing to really deal with are the ethics of discourse. So I expect that my videos will be fairly inflammatory, and that it will generate quite a few responses. So, I have my sort of mission statement. Oh, well, there's Facebook chat. Hello, Facebook chat. I should probably turn the volume down on the other machine, shouldn't I? Yes, I should. Okay. Anyway, as a rule, I consider a good argument to be comprised of two components. The first is addressing the argument in a coherent manner, putting forth one's own, and being as intellectually honest as possible. That's, yes, pretty much how a good argument is. But on YouTube, there's a certain theatrical element, and to do that, I have to both be somewhat eccentric and also rip apart my opponents in a comedic fashion. So, when I do this, any insult to my opponent's intelligence, which will be the most common, I believe, or other slights against them, will not substitute for the argument itself. It will simply complement it and be in addition to. They stand on their own, although they might be used for reductio ad absurdum. Sorry, mispronunciation there. Reductio ad absurdum. Either way, yeah, it's kind of how I operate. So, we'll move on. Yes. Okay. So the first topic is how science works, because I use science, or at least the scientific method, to inform all of my opinions on everything, from abortion to gun safety. I should probably explain how that works. I don't just want to bombard you with things. You have no idea what they are. So, I'll start with the various ways of knowing things. So there's private revelation, inductive reasoning, deductive reasoning, and the often used, but not quite necessarily always talked about, abductive reasoning. You've probably never heard that term before, but it exists. We'll go into it. Alright. First, and all these have their own problems when used alone. Private revelation, for example, is absolutely worthless. Because you can't demonstrate the truth value of a claim that you support using private revelation by God, Zeus, the Muppets, the beagle that's talking to you, golden retriever, whatever. You can't prove that you had that experience, or that God came in your dreams, or that when you went to the cave, the Archangel Gabriel spoke to you and gave you the Quran, etc., or that you sat in front of a tree for, well, underneath a tree for 20 years, meditated, and had a transcendental experience. We can't know these things about you. And whether or not those things are true, if you're making shit up, I will curse, by the way, like a sailor. So, let's take an example. Joan of Arc. Joan of Arc is now a saint. Saint Joan of Arc. And she was responsible, in effect, for the French fighting off the English in the 100 Years' War. She was a 16-year-old girl when she approached the Dauphin of France and said, "God has come to me in a vision. I am the Maiden of Lorraine, given in this prophecy that's a couple hundred years old, that a maiden from the province of Lorraine will free France from external domination." And he believed her. And, I mean, besides being crazy, she was pretty awesome. She managed to outfox English generals and earn the respect of hideously sexist French generals, and she never had any military training whatsoever. She was just that awesome. But she was crazy. Alright? She raised an army, and the first thing she did was to lift the eight-month siege of the city of Orléans. And she slipped into, I'm speaking in third person, Captain America mode when she did this. The message to the Duke of Bedford, who was directing the siege, was, "The Maid and her soldiers will have the victory. Therefore, the Maid is willing that you, Duke of Bedford, should not destroy yourself." Oddly eloquent for an illiterate peasant girl. But eventually she was captured, and the English brought her to an admittedly illegal trial. She was denied most forms of due process that even the Catholic Church at the time prescribed. For example, she was tortured. They weren't supposed to torture you until after you confessed. The torture was punishment. They didn't use torture to acquire information. Until the Spanish Inquisition. But the Roman Inquisition and the Spanish Inquisition were two different things. Anyway, I'm digressing. But because she could not prove that God spoke to her, obviously, they burned her alive. And the same can be said for most other claims of divine revelation, except these days we tend not to burn people. I don't know why. Sometimes I think there's a large group of people that just need to be crucified along the side of the I-10. Whatever. I get certain bloody-minded thoughts at times about people. And when we get into political discussion, we'll get into that. Anyway, that's not today. Alright. The second is inductive reasoning. And inductive reasoning arrives at general conclusions from specific observations. An example of this would be that the claim, many child molesters are molested as children. This person, person A, is a child molester. Therefore, it is likely that he was molested as a child. Okay. Alright. The issue with this is that it's probabilistic. You can't gain 100% certainty. You can't know things. You can accept things. You can be fairly confident of things, but you cannot know things with it. Right, they're probabilistic statements. For example, I know from past experience that the sun will probably rise in the east tomorrow. Rise, I mean, your terms instead of the sun, but I mean, in any case, it will probably rise in the east tomorrow. But something bizarre could happen. We could, for example, collide with a galaxy we have not yet seen, and could go careening away from the sun. Something really bizarre could happen, and our orbit could, not our orbit, but our axis of rotation could pull a 180. Technically, it would have to be a 360 to get the rotation in the same direction. You know what I mean. It could switch direction because of some weird calamity. The sun could go supernova without us having figured it out in advance. That's fairly unlikely, but it could happen. And we could go careening off into space. And it'd be hilarious and terrifying. For the few seconds we lived, because about 8.5 minutes after the sun went supernova, we would be dead. Instantly, but dead. Okay, now. Achilles. Also, no one could kill him throughout the entire Trojan War until they finally breached the walls, and they thought he was invincible. He thought he was invincible. Apparently his mother, according to legend, had dipped him in the river Styx, but held him by his ankle. And apparently he was not invulnerable to arrows shot at his ankles, and thus died. That's actually why the tendon that connects your calf muscle to your foot is called the Achilles tendon. That's where he was shot with an arrow that killed him. Maybe infection, I don't know. Deductive reasoning does give absolute certainty. It derives very specific conclusions from general observations, or general premises, rather. So, an example of this would be, if A is true, then B is false. If B is false, then C is true. A is true, therefore C is false. Or C is true, rather. Sorry. Alright, that is a valid syllogism, just so you know. If the premises are true, the conclusions must by definition be true. And the problem is that this depends on the truth value of your premises. So, to know their truth value, at some point, you could create a set of syllogisms that goes on ad infinitum, but at some point you have to use inductive reasoning, an observation of a specific event, to determine whether these premises are true. So, yeah, that's kind of problematic if you just want to use deductive reasoning. Abductive reasoning is just, everyone uses it every day, but it doesn't get talked about, really. And this is basically an educated guess, whereby you generate a hypothetical explanation B for phenomenon A by postulating a said explanation B, which is sufficient but not necessarily necessary to cause condition A. So an example of this, if you want to get out of the philosophical mumbo-jumbo, would be, if the lawn is wet, you could, for example, postulate that it is wet because it rained the night before. That would be sufficient to cause your lawn being wet, but is not necessary for your lawn being wet. Someone could have turned on your garden hose. Humidity could have simply been high enough and the temperature low enough to cause dew to form in the morning. That kind of thing. Okay, so, science. How does science actually work? Science uses a hypothetico-inductive method. Hypothetico-deductive method, whereby induction or abduction, depending on the circumstance, is used to generate from limited data an explanation for a set of phenomena. It then uses that explanation to generate testable predictions. It extends those, treats them as premises in a deductive argument. If this explanation is true, therefore, proposition A should also be true. They generate a testable prediction whereby they test the conclusion. If the conclusion is false, then you know that your premises need modification. If the conclusion is true, then you don't know that your premises don't need modification, but you do know that it's not false in that particular instance. So, an example. In northern leopard frogs, Ramapipians, say you go to two ponds and you find two tadpoles and you know they're from the species because you saw the mothers lay the eggs, but the tadpoles look different. They have different morphologies. Their body shape's different, their mouth parts are a little bit different, and you're like, what the heck's going on here? So you hypothesize that the tadpoles, using the same genome, can alter their own morphology, their own body shape and condition, in order to better be adapted to specific circumstances within the pond without natural selection having to be involved. So they can do this on their own. The tadpole hatches, and its tail starts out like this, and because there's predators, it becomes bigger, so they can escape better. That kind of deal. Alright. But this does not transmit to their offspring, so their offspring can do the same thing, etc. So they use a single genome for this. So you take sample of tadpoles from the same egg mass, so they come from the same mom and dad pair. Put them in two different sets of tanks. One tank has predators, one tank doesn't. And if the morphology of the tadpoles changes, then you can be reasonably sure that you're dealing with plasticity here, that you're dealing with that within tadpole change in body form. If they don't, then you have a different kettle of fish. Then you have to, for example, change your hypothetical explanation that says, all right, maybe we're dealing with two different species of frog that look very similar and haven't been detected before. So then you'd have to go and you'd have to sample their genomes and run a bunch of crazy Bayesian statistics to figure out if they're different. Okay. In science, there are a few rules you need to follow. The first is falsification testability. So any explanation you arrive at must be capable of being proven false. Not that it will be proven false, but you have to be able to set up conditions where it can be proven false. Alright. This, as an extension, there's methodological naturalism. So, you need to use natural explanations. Things that are grounded in the physical world we can observe, interact with, and play around with. Play God with. Alright. And this is for a variety of reasons I'll get into in a second. And you must make a positive case for your causal explanation. You can't just say, well, explanation A is false or incomplete, or we don't know one of the infinite number of details about explanation A, therefore B is true. That would be a leap of logic, and that is a logical fallacy, and thou shalt not do that in science. Or basic logic, thinking clearly at all kind of thing. And there's Occam's razor. In Latin, pluralitas non est ponenda sine necessitate. Or, in English, plurality should not be ascribed without necessity. Or, if you want to break it down even further and make it all nice and neat, do not multiply the causes of an event beyond what is necessary to explain them. So, if n number of causes are sufficient to explain something, don't add more. Right? It's not necessary. And this avoids several problems. All of these rules avoid several problems. First is that God, Zeus, Satan, a talking snake, whatever, can't be invoked to negate findings in science. You can't find fossils and then say, God put them there to trick us. If we do that, we get nowhere. Absolutely nowhere. You know, you could find germs that cause disease and say, oh no, they're actually not germs, that's just incidental. We're actually dealing with demonic possession still. No, we get nowhere. There's no explanatory power with those sorts of things, those sorts of God-like explanations. And they don't allow us to expand our knowledge of the universe or do much of anything. Sometimes it might even be true. But unless we're actively trying to figure out if it's true, and we're trying to rule out any and all possible physical explanations before we resort to Satan possession, liberate tutte me, exit veris kind of craziness, then we get nowhere. And we end up with people dying from simply easily preventable diseases. We end up not getting into space because we think there's a giant crystalline sphere above our planet. All kinds of craziness. Turtles all the way down. Also, if we don't simply don't understand something yet, we won't stop and say God did it. Newton did this. When Newton couldn't figure out multi-body problems, multiple orbiting bodies around each other, and how their gravitational pulls affect the entire system, he couldn't figure that out. He invented calculus, but he could not figure out that particular application of calculus. So he said, God did it. He threw up his hands and said, God did it, and done. Well, a century or so later, a little over actually, Laplace came along. He's like, I have no need of God, but he said it in French, so it sounded a little more arrogant. If you can get more arrogant than that. And he figured out what's called perturbation theory, where he figured out how all these systems work together and stabilize the solar system. Awesome. Good for him. Yay, Laplace. Alright. And then there's alternative extra causes. You don't want to have alternative extra causes in there. If you do, it obscures weird relationships. It gets messy, so you just leave those out, unless you can't avoid them. Remember, it's the least number of causes which adequately explain the causation of the phenomenon you're examining. So you can't just say God did it because that's the only a single cause. No. It actually has to explain something. So you might have, cause A, which affects this part of the system, cause B, which affects this part of the system, cause C in here. But you don't add extra terms into your equation that don't make any sense. Okay? Don't do that. This is why this whole set of rules is why intelligent design is in science. It violates all of them. Alright? Every last one. Operationally, science also has certain rules as far as how you conduct it. So, when you do science, when you perform an experiment or a rigorous observation regime, you then write up your results in a paper that's usually in double-column print and between 3 and 18 pages long, depending on what you're doing and what journal you're trying to send it to, and you send it off to a journal, such as the American Naturalist. And by journal, we mean a peer-reviewed scientific journal, not writing your own book and claiming that it's awesome. Don't do that. An editor will look at it and go, okay, this fits the format, okay, format's good. and it's suitable for our particular journal, awesome. I will accept it or reject it and tell you to go fuck yourself. If he does not tell you to go fuck yourself, he'll send it off to reviewers who are within your area of expertise, and they will look it over, make sure you didn't make any silly math errors, have holes in your logic the size of Cape Cod, or are otherwise making shit up or talking out of your rectum. If they fail to tell you you're making shit up and talking out of your rectum, they will accept it, and your paper will be published a few months later because they have a backlog. They might also accept it with minor corrections needing to be made. You know, you might want to use this test instead of that one, in statistics, for example. We think it'll still end up the same, but just to be sure, there you go. Fix that, and then it gets published. Or they just tell you to fuck yourself. And that's what peer review is. So that finishes up the first installment. I will be using the scientific method to play with everything. Next installment, I think, will be on abortion, because that'll be fun. I get to make fetus jokes. I love making those, by the way. And, signing off.